My talk this morning is going to focus on what we know about the science of social emotional functioning in eating disorders. And I'd like to start off by thinking with you a little bit about why emotions are important. How do they help us as human beings? And then move on to what we know in terms of the science around how eating disorders, how emotions might contribute to the development of eating disorders, and how emotions might help us to understand why eating disorders get a bit stuck. And finally, to think together a little bit about, knowing all of that, well, what could we do? What could we do differently? And it's such a beautiful place to be in Bournemouth today with this lovely sunny weather. And that really did help my mental health this morning. So I hope you're all the same. First of all, I wanted to start off with a little bit of an experiment. So what I'd like you to do is just to have a brief chat to the person next to you, just about what you did at the weekend. Try to keep your face still whilst you're doing this, okay? Try not to show any emotion in your face or in your body whilst you're having that chat with the person next to you. So kind of take on the persona of a robot, if you can, okay? So have a go at that, and then I'll ask you about what it was like. It's really hard to do it without emotion, isn't it? Absolutely. Social interaction requires emotion. So any kind of social interaction we have, we're expressing emotions, we're recognizing emotions, we're regulating emotions, and it is almost impossible to have a genuine social interaction without expressing emotion in our face and our bodies. So that's really the starting point that I want to leave you with. To think about how emotions and social functioning work together and how we can understand how they affect, how they might be different in people with eating disorders. So as humans, we need emotions, don't we? We've just seen how important it is to express our emotions when we're having social interactions. And researchers in psychology have suggested that emotions are actually primary motivational drives. So they prompt our behaviour, they can change our behaviour. If we come across something that's shocking or scary or surprising, that emotion will guide our behaviour. And emotions are also communication tools. So it's hard to tell people about what you did at the weekend without emotion, because emotion helps you to bring that moment to life, to bring those experiences to life for the person that you're interacting with. And Izzard in 1977 went so far as to say that emotions are the reason for us being. They're the reason for us being human. So that's a really strong statement which really highlights how important emotions are to human functioning. However, at the same time, there's also a lot of literature and research about the problems that might be caused by emotions. There's a darker side of emotions. There's the suggestion that it's emotions that create things like psychological illnesses. We also have difficulties in our culture and our society around emotions. So as Brits, we have this cultural norm of restraint and stoicism. It's colloquially known as the British stiff upper lip. And we're told, don't express emotions too much. Don't let other people know too strongly how you're feeling. Now that might be quite effective in some situations, but in general, day-to-day life, what we need to be doing is sharing our emotions with each other. It not only helps us to communicate what we need, but it also helps other people, it magnetizes us to other people. We want to be around people that express their emotions. But this long tradition, dating really from the Victorian era, that we should be seen and not heard, has really stuck. And this has actually this might be explaining some of the reasons why our young people today are experiencing greater difficulties with their emotional and mental health. And I read a really interesting book recently, written by positive psychologists Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. And this book speaks a lot about some of the conditions facing young people today in universities. And they discuss three untruths, three problematic beliefs that might be shared around emotions that could be behind some of the difficulties that young people are facing. the idea that we're fragile, we shouldn't face difficult emotions, the idea that we need to avoid them because they're dangerous and we should avoid talking about difficult things. Another one is always trust your feelings. Is that right? Should we always trust our emotions? Maybe we can get things wrong. And also this untruth of good versus evil. So things are either good or they're bad, and there's nothing in the middle. And their argument suggests that these three untruths are behind some of the social emotional difficulties that young people are facing today. And I think this is the darker side of emotions, isn't it? It's our cultural norms and society perpetuating myths that emotions should be avoided, that feelings are always right, and if we feel scared, then we shouldn't do the thing that we're facing. And there's good and bad feelings, there's good and bad situations, there's nothing in the middle. So I want to try and leave you with these three untruths, because we'll come back to these a little bit later. However, in spite of that, I would say the times they are a-changing. Even our royal family express emotion in public. So it didn't take me very long to do a quick search on the internet to find these pictures of our royal family smiling, laughing, showing emotions on their faces. So I think it's okay. If they can do it, so can we. So what do we know about emotions in eating disorders? Well, if we look at the research into risk factors, we can see that emotions are really important contributors to some of the vulnerability that to increasing vulnerability to developing an eating disorder. So we know that lots of us will have most of us will have some sort of adverse life experience, and that's certainly common in the histories of people that develop eating disorders. But I would argue that it might be something about how people respond to that adverse experience, how they interpret or process the negative emotional state that is evoked by an adverse experience. And this is a risk factor for eating disorders. Another risk factor which has a kind of emotional context is the negative self-evaluation that people with eating disorders report. So this is a negative, aversive emotional state where people will feel that they're not good enough, or they don't look the right way, or they're not doing things perfectly, and that they must do something about that anxiety that they feel in order to overcome it. And of course, low mood is another risk factor for eating disorders. So we can already see in models of risk factors, in reviews of risk factors, the role of emotions in terms of why people might develop eating disorders. And this has probably got a biological basis to it. So we know from extensive research in the field that people that have eating disorders, if we ask them to go into the MRI scanner and we look at their brains when they're doing tasks, their brains are functioning, they're looking a little bit different to people that don't have eating disorders. And some of the key differences that we find are in the emotional centres of the brain, the amygdala, the structure that processes emotion, particularly fear and threat, seems to be really acting quite differently in people with eating disorders. And also some of the other structures in the brain and the reward system that sensitize people to threats and punishments, these structures and networks seem to be functioning differently in this group of individuals as well. So there's probably a biological basis to some of the reasons why people then need to use quite extreme eating behaviours as a means to manage their emotions. Their brains are processing the world a little bit differently. An early model in the field, which actually was focused on bulimia nervosa, looked at the role of wanting to avoid emotions. So in the early 1990s, the escape model suggested that people get into a negative emotional state, largely related to not feeling that they're good enough, or that other people might be evaluating them negatively, and this provokes anxiety and feelings of low mood. And the Heatherton and Baumeister have suggested that a way to overcome that negative emotional state would be to focus on one thing, to focus on eating, to focus on overeating in this case. So your attention narrows down onto that one stimulus, and for that moment you escape all that negative emotional your negative emotional state. So I think this is really interesting in terms of the history of research around emotions and eating disorders, because it's an early model that tells us that emotions are really important. And we also know that more contemporary models of eating disorders, such as the cognitive interpersonal maintenance model, have a really important role for emotion. So this model tries to think about what keeps eating disorders going, what perpetuates them, what keeps them stuck. And we can see here one of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle relates to a person's emotional style. So we know that people with eating disorders have high levels of anxiety. They struggle to manage, to regulate their emotions. They struggle to know what to do with their emotions, and may then turn to eating disorder behaviours as a way to manage. And that keeps the illness stuck. Another model in our field that considers the role of emotions in keeping eating disorders stuck is the Diagnostic model. And this model, suggested by Chris Fairburn and colleagues, highlights how difficulties tolerating mood might then provoke some of the eating disorder behaviours. And we can see down here, life happens, we all experience difficult situations in our lives, and we experience emotions in response to that. And people with eating disorders, it's hypothesised here, might be then engaging eating disorder behaviours to actually manage those emotions, perhaps in a temporary way. A third model I'd like to share with you, which focuses, which is very interesting actually, which I think you'll find quite interesting to think about, has been developed by Tom Lynch, and he suggests that the difficulties in emotional functioning in people with eating disorders could be understood on a spectrum of control. And this goes from over-control, so this is where people might be really inhibiting their emotions, inhibiting their emotional expression, trying to do things perfectly, following rules, trying to get everything right, trying to do things in particular ways in keeping with the eating disorder rules. And it's a bit like a pressure cooker, isn't it? So if you're putting your your pan on the hob and there's water in it and it's boiling and the lid's on top, and you're trying to keep it all in and you're trying to keep it all down and don't let anyone know what's happening for me right now, what happens? The lid inevitably flies off. And the idea is that then people maybe go down to the other end of the spectrum and they lose control, they experience under control. And this can be behaviours that are more impulsive, maybe binging and purging behaviours, people being perhaps very chaotic and experiencing a lot of distress and interference in their lives because of that. And that's not nice, that's a scary place to be often, from one extreme to another. So this is inevitably people say, oh, I've got to kind of get back down here and I need to get everything right again. I need to kind of get back down to the being in control end. So you can really see, can't you, how people can move between these different sort of ends of the spectrum as ways of regulating emotions. And what we want to try and think about is how do we get people a bit more to the middle so that they're not completely over-controlled and they're not completely under-controlled, somewhere in the middle of that tightrope. Now, thinking about all of this, these models and what we know about the importance of emotions in eating disorders is really significant, because we need emotions to help us with our social functioning, because social functioning is one of the key, social support is one of the key ways that people can get out of their illness. And we've got a wealth of studies, qualitative and quantitative work that highlights how people who've recovered value the role of others in their recovery. Recovery was supported through the efforts of kind friends and family members. successful recovery requires social support. So being able to use your emotional skills really effectively in social situations is a really good means of accessing that vital social support. So I really feel this is such an important area in our field when we're thinking about recovery. Now, one of the problems in clinical psychology is that we always focus on deficits and problems and what's gone wrong and what's not right. But I really think that we need to turn that around. We need to start with what's going well. What can our patients do? What can our loved ones do? What can the people that we work with, that we want to help, what can they do well? And the good news is, in emotional functioning, this has been studied a little bit. So we do know from 2 reviews that people with eating disorders have no problems at all recognising basic emotions in the faces of others. So if we show them happy, sad, angry, disgusted, fearful, surprised faces, they're quite happy to name those emotions and they're confident in doing that. We also know that their ability to differentiate particularly positive emotion in the faces of others is absolutely intact. There doesn't seem to be any issues there at all. And so these are 2 areas of social emotional functioning that people with eating disorders are doing well. So these relative strengths are really important. At the same time, people that are affected by eating disorders also tell us that they have challenges in their social emotional functioning. So this was a study that we conducted a few years ago where we handed out a questionnaire to people with eating disorders, people who'd recovered and people who'd never had an eating disorder. And the line along the bottom in blue, these are the people that don't have an eating disorder. So all of the data are plotted relative to that. And what we can see is across these different domains of social functioning, so how you manage at work, at home, in your social leisure, in personal hobbies and activities that you like to do, there's elevated levels of difficulty for people with both anorexia nervosa in black there and bulimia nervosa in the brown line. Good news is that the recovered group are a little bit closer to those who've never had an eating disorder. So some of these things can get better with recovery, but they are still struggling a little bit. So these data really highlight to us that people with eating disorders are saying we want some help in these areas. So what might be some of the areas that we could understand more about and think about how to help? I'd like to go through 4 of these with you. So the first one is about complex emotion recognition. The second area is about the ability to manage or regulate emotion. And then third, we'll look at how people express emotion in their face and in their body. And finally, we'll look at some emerging evidence on eye contact, a really key social skill that allows us to function well in interpersonal contexts. So some studies have also looked at complex emotion recognition. So what they do is they just show the eye area of the face like this. It's pretty tricky, isn't it, when you've just got the eyes to actually detect what a person might be thinking and feeling. And what we've been finding is that there's a small but significant reduction in this skill in people with eating disorders. So it's a bit more challenging for this group to actually name the emotion that the person is expressing through the eyes. So this is where it's a complex emotion. So not the basic ones, but the more complex ones. Like the example here is things like joking or amused. These are slightly more nuanced emotions. It's not a massive difference, but it still highlights some of the difficulties that people might be experiencing in recognising emotions in an interpersonal context. There's also research that suggests that this is more difficult for people intrapersonally. So that means their own ability to recognise and label their emotions. And this is termed alexithymia. So having difficulties in this area is known as alexithymia. And a review conducted a few years ago of lots of literature on this found that there were consistent difficulties in the ability to detect and recognise and label one's own emotion in populations of people with eating disorders. So far we know that it's a bit more challenging for people to recognise complex emotions, and it's a bit more challenging than average for people to know what they're thinking and feeling. Let's move on now to emotion regulation. There's been quite a number of self-report studies in this area, and what they tend to find is that people report difficulties regulating their emotions, difficulties tolerating, accepting, being aware of their emotions, knowing what to do with them. And there is a bit of evidence that this might be more difficult, or most difficult, for those who use binging and purging behaviours. But the good news is that studies do show that this can be improved through treatment. Emotion regulation is a skill. So it's something that we're all learning. I'm certainly not stood here saying that I can do it perfectly. I'm still learning too. And it's really good news that we can help people to acquire that skill and develop it through treatment. There's also been a number of experimental studies that have tried to look at how people regulate emotions. And this particular piece of research was a study that we conducted where we showed people on a computer screen pictures of faces. And the faces were coloured in different inks. So you can see up at the top there, some of them are red, some of them are green, some of them are yellow, some of them are blue. And we asked people to just name the colour of the ink. So they didn't have to say anything about the face, they just had to say what colour is that particular picture presented in. And what we found was that compared to a neutral stimulus, so pictures of chairs, people took a lot longer to say the colour of the pictures of faces than they did of the pictures of chairs. And as a psychological mechanism, what we think this is about is that the stimulus, the face, is interfering with the person's ability to process that particular colour. Yeah? So when they're looking at that face, it's really significant to them, it's really salient to them. So it then takes them a bit longer to say what the colour of the ink is. And this indicates to us the significance or the salience of this stimulus to people with eating disorders. So faces are a bit more threatening than average for a person with an eating disorder. And we also looked at whether this was specific to any type of emotion. And what we found was that anger was a particularly salient emotion. So when we had pictures of angry faces, people took even longer to say the colour that the picture was printed in compared to other more neutral emotional states. So it does seem that anger is a particularly salient emotion. So what might this look like in a social context? If social stimuli, if faces are quite threatening to you and they're particularly angry faces, how might that affect your ability to interact with others? Well, we have got some really interesting research that suggests that people with eating disorders are really sensitive in social situations. Maybe we can understand a little bit about why. If the stimuli that they're viewing is very threatening to them. They also make very unfavourable social comparisons. So if you ask people with eating disorders to say where they rank in the social hierarchy, they'll say, you know, everybody's better than me, I'm more inferior, and they're very unkind to themselves in terms of how they feel that others perceive them. And this is sort of accompanied by difficulties in being able to perceive warmth from others. So there's a bit of a double whammy there. And another piece of research we've been conducting to try and understand what this might look like in a social context involved sharing cartoons with people with eating disorders. And these cartoons depicted socially frustrating situations. So if you can see here, in this cartoon, these people have been driving to the train station, and unfortunately, the person who's giving their friend a lift, his car broke down on the way. So he's saying, it's a shame that my car broke down and you've missed the train because of it. That's a pretty awkward social situation, isn't it? You've made your friend miss their train because your car wasn't in good repair. And what we asked people to do was to think about how they might respond. And what we found was really interesting. People with eating disorders were blaming themselves, and they were also not very able to come up with good solutions to the situation. How might they get out of that socially frustrating situation? So it's quite overwhelming to be able to come up, it's quite overwhelming when there's a difficult social situation and you've got to regulate something like frustration or aggression or a bit of anger that you might feel because things haven't worked out quite well. Some other research in this area from Valentina Cardi and colleagues has also highlighted how people with eating disorders seem to really be on the lookout for more rejecting faces. So if you show them an array of different images, they're much more attuned to rejecting faces, and actually they disengage their attention, they take their attention away from accepting faces. So that's quite difficult, isn't it? Imagine going around and you're looking only for rejecting faces, and you're not captured, your attention isn't captured by people that are affirming you, that are confirming your right to be there and to have fun together and enjoyment together. You can imagine that would make life quite tricky. So this kind of sensitivity to negative social emotions seems to be really important. Now the next area is about then how people express their emotions. So we've thought about how people recognise emotions in themselves and others, how people might regulate emotions or struggle to regulate emotions. What about being able to share with others what they're thinking and feeling? Well, a series of studies have been conducted which are really novel and interesting and have attempted to try and understand this. These studies have used films, and they've asked people with eating disorders to watch two different films or excerpts from two different films. One is a very funny film, so I don't know if you've seen 4 Weddings and a Funeral. I mean, I just have to look at Rowan Atkinson and I'm sort of laughing already. And the other film is a more negatively emotionally valenced film, so a sad film. And it's a scene from the film Shadowlands, where one of the characters is dying. And what the researchers here have done is that they actually film people as they watch these films. So they're watching them on a computer, and there's just a little camera at the top, and it's filming them, it's looking at their face as they're actually watching that video. And after they've watched the film, they ask people to rate how much emotion they felt. And there's a really interesting discrepancy. So people with eating disorders, on the sort of rating scale, they'll say, yes, I felt really, really happy when I was watching the 4 Weddings and a Funeral. I felt really, really sad when I was watching the kind of death scene in Shadowlands. But when we look back at the videos of people watching these videos, we're not seeing it on the faces of the individuals with eating disorders. So there's much less emotional expression actually conveyed whilst interacting with that film. And there was a really nice review a couple of years ago which pulled together all of these data, because there's been a number of studies that have used a similar paradigm. And using a special piece of software to look at this more objectively, the overall gist was that particularly for positive emotions, the sort of data were stronger for positive emotions. People with anorexia nervosa were not expressing this emotion on their face as much. And if we think back to what it was like to have that social interaction and to be interacting with somebody who perhaps wasn't expressing emotion on their face and telling you about their weekend in that way, that affects you, doesn't it, as the conversational partner? That makes it a bit more challenging for you. So one of the things that staff I have interacted with over the years say, particularly new staff, when they come onto the ward and they say, I'm not really sure what the people are thinking and feeling. When I walk into the room, when I walk into the living room on the ward, everybody's got quite a blank face. And it's not that they look depressed or sad, I just don't really know what they're thinking and feeling. And they're coming into the ward rounds and they're saying that everything's fine, and it just doesn't register, it doesn't make sense. So this discrepancy between people feeling really intense emotion inside and not being able to express it is really tough for the person, and it can be really tough for those trying to care for them. So another way that we've tried to investigate this has been looking at how people express emotions in their body. There's not very much research in the field actually that's looked at what we call non-verbal communication, or we might refer to it as body language. So a couple of years ago we developed a kind of novel paradigm to try and understand this. And we actually filmed people with eating disorders having just a real life brief discussion with a researcher, talking about positive things, negative things, neutral things. And then we developed a special system to try and look at how they might express emotion in their body. So we were interested in how they orientated their body during the social interaction. Were they facing their conversational partner, or were they turned away? We were interested in perhaps the positioning of their body. Were they sort of leaning towards the person? Were they kind of leaning back? Were they conveying interest in the social interaction? We were interested in where their head was positioned. So were they looking at the conversational partner, or were they looking down or away at all? But most importantly, and I think most interestingly, we were also interested in how they use their hands to support their communication. So this is where things always get quite awkward when I talk about this research, because people start to notice your hand gestures and, are you giving eye contact? Is your face orientated towards me? And people say, oh, so I'm starting to think about it a little bit more. But social psychologists have helped us to understand all the different ways that we might use our body to actually support our communication. So some of the ways that we might use our hands, for example, might be as we're speaking, we kind of move them like this to tell a story, or we might use our hands to kind of indicate something that we're talking about. I'm talking about this poster over here. Or we might use them in a way to depict a real or an imaginary situation. So yesterday I was drawing a square. So these are all different types of social communication that we use. We don't even think about it until we have to. And these are happening in a kind of subtle way as we're communicating with others. So a little bit like the film's task, as well as recording on a video what people looked like in these social interactions, we also asked people to rate on a questionnaire how competent they felt they were during that social interaction. It was quite interesting because overall there wasn't any difference between people with eating disorders and people without on this particular measure. But if you kind of delve into the detail of this particular questionnaire, we can see that people with, in this case it was anorexia nervosa, felt that they were less socially composed. So they felt that they didn't come across as well as people without the illness. They also looked to their conversational partner more for kind of confirmation that they were doing okay, and they kind of rated that more highly. And the other area in which people rated their skills a bit differently was, I think this is quite interesting, was in the use of wit and humour. So people with eating disorders reported on this scale that they might use humour more to kind of manage the social situation. So I think that's quite an interesting one. But the really interesting findings were around how people use their gestures, how they use their hands and their bodily cues to communicate with the conversational partner in this kind of experiment. What we found was that people used their hands a lot less. They were very still during the social interaction. So they didn't really use gestures to support their speech as much. They used a lot less, they made a lot less use of their hands to support a description of something, whether it was real or metaphorical. And so they looked quite different to people without eating disorders. And the raters that were trying to understand this were blind to the hypotheses of the study. So they didn't know what they were being asked to rate. And they didn't know which person was necessarily, well, they might have guessed, but they weren't told which person was in which group, the eating disorder group or the non-eating disorder group. So I think what this tells us is that people with eating disorders may have some inefficiencies in their social communication, which might help us to understand a bit more about why they are telling us that social interactions are more challenging. So what about the ability to actually infer emotional states in others? So the previous work was about how people might use their own body language. What about the ability to read other people through their body language? There are also a number of studies in this area, and what they seem to find is that in young people and adults with eating disorders, it's a bit more challenging for this group to actually understand what a person might be feeling from their bodily cues. So these are really clever studies where they get actors and they attach lights to their joints. And then you can show the participants these stimuli and ask them, you know, what's that person thinking and feeling? What's going on for them right now? These findings, however, seem to be stronger for those with anorexia nervosa. So far, they don't seem to be as the same for people with bulimia, which is quite interesting. Now, this fourth area of social emotional skills I'd like to come to think about with you is eye contact. Eye contact is a really important social skill. When we're having a social interaction, I don't know if you know this, but on average, we're making eye contact with the person around 80% of the time. So we don't just stare at them, we don't sort of look away all the time, we make intermittent eye contact. So if anyone comes and talks to me, you know, later in the day, don't worry, I'm not going to be assessing what your bodily cues are or, you know, how much eye contact you're giving. We make this intermittent eye contact, so we'll be chatting to somebody and then we'll kind of look away and then we'll come back. So in this particular study, we had 3 different conditions. The first one was that we had participants looking at static images. So these were just faces that popped up on a screen, conveying basic emotions. So we had happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, and surprise. And then in the second condition, we had people interacting with a video on a computer of 2 actors that were just discussing, you know, what they were planning that week. And then in the third condition, we actually asked the person to have a real-life social interaction with a research assistant. And whilst they were doing these 3 tasks, we used an eye tracker to actually look at where people were fixating their gaze. Now, for those of you that might be getting a little bit worried about ethics here, these people are not blindfolded, so there was no blindfolding happening. What those black things are trying to depict is what we call the regions of interest. So these are the areas on the face where the eye tracker was attuned to, and it was trying to pick up the extent to which participants were actually fixating their eye gaze on that particular area of the face. So we can see kind of the eyes of the static image, and then of course the eyes of the actors that were moving on the scene there, and then finally the same thing in the real life social interaction. And what we found in this piece of work was that people with anorexia nervosa made a lot less eye contact than those without the illness. So do you remember I was saying that we tend to make eye contact, we tend to fixate on the eyes of our conversational partner about 80% of the time. We can see that people with anorexia nervosa are doing that a lot less. So when we've got the static social stimulus, so just a face on a computer screen, people are looking away from the eyes quite a lot. In fact, they're only looking at the eyes for about just over 30% of the time. So this is not a nice image for people to look at. It's not attractive for them to be looking in the person's eyes. And similarly, we can see the difference there between those with anorexia nervosa and the controls right on the far end there, in terms of looking at the video of the actors interacting, and again during the real life social interaction. People with anorexia nervosa were only looking at the eyes for about 60% of the time. So that's quite an important subtle cue that people might be giving out. And it might be because people feel really anxious in social situations, and that's a common thing that we do, isn't it? When we feel anxious, we kind of avert our gaze, we don't want to look at it, we don't want to kind of look at the person because that might be quite overwhelming for us. But the message that gives the person that we're interacting with may not be the one that we want them to have. We might want to talk to them. We might want them to help us and support us, but there's a difference there in our sort of subtle social skills that makes that a little bit more challenging. So I think, to summarise so far, some of the key themes in this research around social emotional functioning in eating disorders point to a degree of avoidance. They point to some inefficiencies in social skills. So we're not talking about people who are completely inept or people that are, cannot do it whatsoever. We're talking about small but important differences in a range of social emotional abilities. Now, one of the reasons why people might experience these inefficiencies can be because people get out of practice. Eating disorders isolate you. You might have to have regular hospital admissions. You're away from your family and friends. And so perhaps people become de-skilled. Eating disorders also commonly hit during adolescence, and this is a time of really important social development, social emotional development, where our social lives become more sophisticated. And so it might be that people are a little bit behind, perhaps, in developing their skills, and they could be supported and coached to catch up. Another key theme here is that people with eating disorders seem to be telling us and showing us through experimental work that social situations are really tricky, they're really threatening, and on the other side, we know as a society how toxic loneliness can be. So in elderly people die earlier because if they're on their own, loneliness is a really difficult emotion and a really difficult state to manage. And the final point is about what others might experience. So if you're not expressing your emotions in your face and your body, but you're feeling them really strongly inside, what impact might that perhaps have on your conversational partner? People that I've worked with often tell me that friends have rejected them, that they don't see them anymore, that they're not really bothered with them anymore, and that's really sad to hear. But it might be that experience is because it's quite hard for people to know how to respond. And we also see that in professional carers. There are studies that show that people find this group of individuals more challenging to work with and are quite frightened sometimes to work with them. So that might be mirrored at all levels of the system. So finally, what can we do to help? What can we do about this, given all this really interesting science? Well, the first thing I would suggest is that we need to become really good at social emotional skills ourselves. We don't have to be perfect. We just need to reflect on what we're good at and the areas that we find more tricky and be a bit more genuine about it. So it's a bit like when you're on the plane and they say, if the cabin pressure drops, put your own oxygen mask on first. So the things that we can do to help others will often start with us thinking about what we're good at ourselves. Are we good social interactors? Are we good at being calm in stressful situations? Who do we look to when we need social support or emotional support? So kind of empowering carers, empowering us to take care of ourselves will then help us to help the people that we'd like to help. The next thing I'd like to suggest is that we need to go back to basics. I think we need to make emotions great again. We need to get rid of all of this being seen and not heard and the stiff upper lip, and that is definitely starting to change in society. But we can go back to basics with the people that we're supporting and caring for. So one of the things that we do on the ward is we do really basic emotional training, and staff get involved in this as well. And we can do this in all kinds of different ways. It might be for some people that they'd like a kind of emotional thermometer. So they've got sort of high intensity emotions, red hot, and then there's a bit of a scale. It might be that we then think about different types of emotions. So just in this example here, we've got kind of colour-coded sort of categories of emotions. And another thing that we often use is the Inside Out movie. I don't know if people have seen that. So this is a really fun, I think it's Disney Pixar, isn't it? Movie which is all about what goes on in your brain and what your emotions are doing. So using metaphors, using really creative ways to help people to get more in touch with their emotions, to start to be able to label them. Just something as basic as sharing a list of emotion words with a person that you're supporting and asking them to see if any of those emotions might match what they're feeling in their body at the time. These are really basic skills that we can all be thinking about sharing. The next idea that I've got is about how we can help people with eating disorders to maximise and build and develop their social networks. So again, starting with ourselves, map out our social networks. Who do we have in our social system? Are there people that might be able to, are there people in the person's system that you might be able to get them back in touch with? How might they be able to grow that social network? How might they be able to rekindle old relationships? One of the things that's really struck me over the years of working with this group is that when people come in for treatment, friends will come out of nowhere. They may have not seen the person for, a decade, years. Old family friends come and visit the person. And that's a really important step forwards to help people to kind of rebuild their social confidence and rekindle old relationships. So doing a bit of a relationship map with the person can be really helpful. And it might be that the person has a very small social network. So what skills and strengths and abilities might they need to build that social network? What skills and strengths could they actually use to engage with others? So have they got any hobbies or interests that they might be able to put into place to kind of meet new people, to build their social support network? And that can often include things like going on courses, maybe voluntary work, maybe some paid work if the person's able to. And I think it starts with one small step. So, it doesn't have to be meeting everybody, at a party. The first step might be something like just sending a text or replying to a text or reaching out in some way on social media, sending a birthday card, just to kind of start to get the ball rolling. I'd like to come back to those three untruths. Remember at the start, the dark side of emotions, the three difficult, the three challenging, I suppose, aspects of our social understanding that might be explaining some of the challenges that young people are facing. So what might help to prepare the person for the road? Well, I think cognitive behavioural therapy skills could be helpful here. So this is the idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, not weaker. Stronger. Going through difficult emotions is where we get new learning in the brain. When we actually experience and learn to tolerate negative emotional states, This helps our brain to learn and to understand how to manage in the future. So we, as professional carers and loved ones of people with eating disorders, we want to try and avoid this overprotection and support the person to face their fears, to use coping strategies to actually overcome difficult situations. And that will really help people to build resilience, because overcoming a challenging emotion is something that can build robustness and resilience. The second untruth was about emotional reasoning, wasn't it? It was thinking about how emotions are always accurate. So I think the second thing that we might do to help prepare the person for the road is to challenge emotional reasoning. Don't take feelings at face value. Emotions are really helpful. If we're walking down a street and our sort of hairs prick up on the back of our neck and we start to feel quite jittery and we start to feel quite hot and a bit shaky, it may well be that somebody, is behind us and we don't want them there, or we just look round and the area doesn't look so good, and it's right that we might be frightened. That is a really great motivational, a really great, that's a way that emotions help us. But sometimes we can get a bit tricked and we can think that things are much scarier than they are, or we can think that things are more threatening and dangerous than they are. So it's really good to have this is just a CBT skill, it's a skill for life really, which is about thinking, is my first interpretation accurate? Yeah, is what I'm feeling about this situation, is it correct? What might be an alternative one? Is it a useful one? If I'm feeling that people are not liking this, is that true? And is it the most helpful interpretation I could come up with? What might be some other possibilities here? And I think that what goes hand in hand with this is being curious about what you're actually feeling and having conversations with people to say, well, say a bit more about that. That's really interesting. You're saying that you're feeling fat, but what might you actually be thinking and feeling beneath the surface? What's actually going on in this situation that's making you feel this negative emotional state? And can I help you with that? And then another way to try and help to prepare the person for the road is to help people to get more into the middle, to get away from this kind of dichotomy of good versus bad, of over control versus under control, to help people to challenge that way of thinking and being by helping them to explore different perspectives. So if we think back to the slide towards the start where we had the image of the brain, all those different structures in the brain that research have shown, or I suppose networks in the brain that research has shown might look a little bit different in people with eating disorders. One of them is the prefrontal cortex. And this part of the brain is really helpful for helping us to take different perspectives and to adopt different ways of looking at problems. So we can help people to develop those skills by having those sorts of conversations. That's really interesting that that's what you're thinking. What are the other ways of looking at this? Devil's advocate. What's the worst that could happen? What might be more in the grey area in the middle? And the final point on this slide is about us modelling, I suppose, emotional openness, being genuine, being radically open, really, about what we're thinking and feeling, so that we can make these things more transparent to others. So I know that many people in the audience are health professionals, and of course we don't want to be telling our patients our life stories, but being a bit open about what we're thinking and feeling and being genuine in our interactions with our service users is a really fantastic way of helping them to see that that's the way forwards. Being open, compassionate and curious. Another strategy I think that could be helpful to help people with eating disorders with their social emotional functioning is to borrow some skills from emotion-focused therapy. So one of the things that we teach carers is to help, attend to the emotion of their loved one. So just notice an emotion, see if you can notice any changes in that person's body. So in this example, I'm noticing that your fists are clenched and you've gone pale. Yeah. And then try and label what you can see. So I can see that you're probably feeling really angry right now. Okay, so you're trying to help the person to make a connection between what's going on in their body and what that might be, what the name for it might be, what the description of it might be. Now you might get it wrong and the person will say, no, I'm not, I'm excited or whatever. Yeah, that's okay. You can say, okay, I can see that you're really excited. Yeah. So we want to try and attend to the emotion, to label it, and then most importantly, validate it. Okay, we want to say to people, you know what, it's completely natural that you'd be feeling really angry in this situation because I've asked you to eat this meal and you don't want to. And that's okay. It's okay to feel angry. I'm here to support you with that anger and to get through this together. Okay? So going back to those kind of emotional untruths, the first one was about the untruth of fragility, wasn't it? That we can't allow people to feel aversive, strong, negative emotional states. And this is where we get problems because people then learn to avoid them. So what we're trying to do here is to say, it's really natural, it's really understandable that you'd be feeling angry or scared in this situation, and it's okay to feel like that. If I were in your shoes, I would feel like that too. And then the final step is to try and meet that emotional need. So if you were scared, if you were angry, what would you want the person to do? What would you want your loved one or the person that was there with you to do to support you? Think about that. Put yourself in that person's shoes and think about what they might need to meet that need. So if they're angry, they might need a very calm person, or they might need somebody to help them sort of express it in some way, depending on the context. So we've got attend, label, validate, and meet the need. So I think this talk has come to an end. I think we've probably got a couple of moments left for questions. But before I do, I'd like to thank my funders, and I'd like to thank my mentors and collaborators. And I'd like to thank you all for listening.